William Temple Hornaday, Sc.D. was an American zoologist, conservationist, taxidermist, and author. He served as the first director of the New York Zoological Park, known today as the Bronx Zoo, and he was a pioneer in the early wildlife conservation movement in the United States. Biography. Hornaday was born in Avon, Indiana, and educated at Oskaloosa College, the Iowa State Agricultural College, and in Europe. After serving as a taxidermist at Henry August Ward's Natural Science establishment in Rochester, New York, he spent 1.5 years, 1877 to 1878, in India and Ceylon collecting specimens. In May 1878 he reached Southeast Asia and traveled in Malaya and Sarawak in Borneo. His travels inspired his first publication, 2 Years in the Jungle. In 1882, he was appointed chief taxidermist of the United States National Museum, a post he held until his resignation in 1890. In his position at the museum, Hornaday was tasked with inventorying the museum's specimen collection of American buffalo, which was meager. He then undertook a census of bison by writing to ranchers, hunters, army officers, and zookeepers across the American West and in Canada. Based on first-hand accounts, Hornaday estimated that as recently as 1867 there were approximately 15 million wild bison in the American West. Through his census, he ascertained that those numbers had rapidly depleted. In a letter written to his superior at the Smithsonian, George Brown Good, Hornaday reported that, in the United States, the extermination of all the large herds of buffalo is already an accomplished fact. In 1886, Hornaday went out west to the Musselshell River region of Montana, where the last surviving herds of wild American buffalo live. He was tasked with collecting specimens from the region for the United States National Museum collections, so that future generations would know what the buffalo looked like after their expected extinction. The buffalo that Hornaday mounted remained on exhibit until the 1950s, when the museum underwent an exhibit modernization program. The Smithsonian sent the specimens to Montana, where they were placed in storage. After many years of neglect, they were rediscovered, restored, and placed on display in 1996 at the Museum of the Northern Great Plains in Fort Benton, Montana. The decimation of the species that Hornaday witnessed had a profound effect on him, transforming him into a conservationist. In addition to the specimens for the collection, he acquired live specimens that he brought back to Washington, D.C., which formed the nucleus of the Department of Living Animals he created at the Smithsonian, the precursor to the National Zoological Park, which he helped establish a few years later in 1889. Hornaday served as the zoo's first director, but left soon thereafter after conflict with the head of the Smithsonian, Samuel Pierpont Langley. Bronx Zoo director. In 1896, the newly chartered New York Zoological Society enticed Hornaday back to the zoo field by offering him the opportunity to create a world-class zoo. Hornaday played a commanding role in selection of the site for the Bronx Zoo, a nickname he hated, which opened in 1899, and in the design of early exhibits. He served in the triple role of director, general curator, and curator of mammals. Among his several activities, he established one of the world's most extensive collections, insisted on unprecedented standards for exhibit labeling, promoted lecture series, and offered studio space to wildlife artists. When he retired in 1926, he was succeeded as Bronx Zoo director by W. Reed Blair. Scandal at the zoo. Dr. Hornaday's tenure as director of the New York Zoo met with controversy in September 1906, when Otabenga, a pygmy native of the Congo, was placed on display in the monkey house. Benga shot targets with a bow and arrow, wove twine, and wrestled with an orangutan. Although, according to the New York Times, few expressed audible objection to the sight of a human being in a cage with monkeys as companions, black clergymen in the city took great offense. "Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes," said the Reverend James H. Gordon, superintendent of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn. "We think we are worthy of being considered human beings, with souls." New York Mayor George B. McClellan, Jr. refused to meet with the clergyman, drawing the praise of Dr. Hornaday, who wrote to him, "When the history of the Zoological Park is written, this incident will form its most amusing passage." As the controversy continued, Hornaday remained unapologetic, insisting that his only intention was to put on an ethnological exhibit. In another letter he said that he and Madison Grant, the secretary of the New York Zoological Society, who 10 years later would publish The Racist Tract, The Passing of the Great Race, considered it imperative that the society should not even seem to be dictated to by the black clergymen. Still, Hornaday decided to close the exhibit after just 2 days, and on Monday, September 8, Benga could be found walking the zoo grounds, often followed by a crowd, howling, jeering and yelling. Benga committed suicide in 1916 when his return trip to the Congo was delayed by World War I wildlife conservation legacy. Hornaday's advocacy is credited with preserving the American bison from extinction. At the end of the 19th century, he began to plan, with Theodore Roosevelt's support, a Society for the Protection of the Bison. Years later, as director of the Bronx Zoo, Hornaday acquired bison, and by 1903 there were 40 bison on the zoo's 10-acre range. In 1905, the American Bison Society was formed at a meeting in the Bronx Zoo's Lion House with Hornaday as its president. When the first large game preserve in America was created in 1905, the Wichita National Forest and Game Preserve, Hornaday offered 15 individuals for the Bronx Zoo had for a reintroduction program. He personally selected the release site and the individual animals. By 1919, 9 herds had been established in the U.S. through the efforts of the American Bison Society. During his lifetime, Hornaday published almost 24 books and hundreds of articles on the need for conservation, frequently presenting it as a moral obligation. Most notable was the 1913 publication and distribution to every member of Congress of his best-selling Our Vanishing Wildlife, Its Extermination and Preservation, a riveting call to action against the destructive forces of overhunting. The historian Douglas Brinkley has described it, what Upton Sinclair's The Jungle had been for meatpacking reform. Our Vanishing Wildlife was for championing disappearing creatures like prairie chickens, whooping cranes, and roseate spoonbills. Hornaday appealed to readers' emotions, urging them that the birds and mammals now are literally dying for your help. Quote, although he was not entirely opposed to hunting, he became increasingly convinced of the perils that modern hunting, shaped by new firearm technology and easier access to wildlife by cars, posed to wildlife populations. As he proclaimed with characteristic zeal in Our Vanishing Wildlife, it is time for the people who don't shoot to call a halt on those who do, and if this be treason, then let my enemies make the most of it. Throughout his career, he lobbied and provided testimony for several congressional acts for wildlife protection laws. In 1913, he established the Permanent Wildlife Protection Fund as a vehicle to fund his tireless conservation lobbying efforts. Through a network of conservation activists throughout the United States, Hornaday pushed at both the state and federal level for protective legislation, national park parks, wildlife refuges, and international treaties. By 1915, the American Museum Journal declared that Hornaday has no doubt inaugurated and carried to success more movements for the protection of wild animal life than has any other man in America. Influence on Scouting. Hornaday had a large impact on the Scouting movement and especially the Boy Scouts of America. Not only is there a series of conservation awards named after him, but his beliefs and writings are a major reason conservation and ecology have long been an important part of the BSA's program. This awards program was created in 1915 by Dr. Hornaday. He named the award the Wildlife Protection Medal. Its purpose was to challenge Americans to work constructively for wildlife conservation and habitat protection. After his death in 1938, the award was renamed in Dr. Hornaday's honor and became a BSA award. Death. Hornaday died in Stamford, Connecticut and was buried at Putnam Cemetery in Greenwich, Connecticut. Relatives. William Temple Hornaday married Josephine Chamberlain in 1879. They were married for 58 years, until his death. The Hornadays had one daughter, Helen. To this day the Hornaday bloodline continues to live on. Hornadays are still making a positive impact on our environment. Take the famous beekeeper Douglas Hornaday for example. In 2013 he was awarded the Rachel Carson Award for his impact on the environment in his local community. Travel writer Temple Fielding was the grandson of William Temple Hornaday. A year after his death, in 1938, at the suggestion of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the National Park Service named a peak Mount Hornaday in the Absaroka Range in Yellowstone National Park for him. Selected books: 2 Years in the Jungle, Free Run on the Congo, The Extermination of the American Bison, Taxidermy and Zoological Collecting, The Man Who Became a Savage, Guide to the New York Zoological Park, The American Natural History, Campfires in the Canadian Rockies, Campfires on Desert and Lava, Popular Official Guide to the New York Zoological Park, Our Vanishing Wildlife, Wildlife Conservation in Theory and Practice, Bibliography, Andre, Marianne, The Accidental Conservationist, William T. Hornaday, The Smithsonian Bison Expeditions and the U.S. National Zoo, Endeavor 29, No. 3, pp. 109-113. Bechtel, Stephen. Mr. Hornaday's War: How a Peculiar Victorian Zookeeper Waged a Lonely Crusade for Wildlife That Changed the World. Beacon Press, 2012. Bridges, William. Gathering of Animals, An Unconventional History of the New York Zoological Society. New York, Harper & Ambro, 1974. Della, Gregory J. An American Crusader, William Temple Hornaday and Wildlife Protection, 1840–1940. Ph.D. dissertation, Lehigh University, 2001. Della, Gregory J. The Most Defiant Devil, William Temple Hornaday and His Controversial Crusade to Save American Wildlife, Charlottesville, U of Virginia p. 2013. Dolph, James A. Bringing Wildlife to the Millions, William Temple Hornaday, The Early Years, 1854–1896. Ph.D. dissertation, University of Massachusetts, 1975. Colstead, Sally A. Henry Auguste Ward and American Museum Development. University of Rochester Library Bulletin 38.